This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD via Zoom, Rachel DeWoskin. She is an author and also uh, an instructor and leader at the Humans of Life role, a PNAP project, People plus Neighborhoods Education Arts Project. How are you today, Rachel?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Very, very well. So glad to have you here. First
Thank
of
you for
all,
having me.
you're welcome. First of all, Rachel, let our listeners know a little bit about your background, how you teach, and your work as an author.
So, first of all, it's so nice to be here, and it was so nice to meet everyone at the community reading a couple of weeks ago. I've been a professor for 23 years. I've taught at New York University, Boston University, and the University of Chicago. And I'm a writer mainly of fiction and poetry. I wrote one book, which was nonfiction. And I'm now also an educator for the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project, PNAP. And I teach in that capacity at Stateville. Where my students are writing stories of their lives, and they're writing very thoughtfully and beautifully about freedom and imagination and what it's like to be a human being, which I think is what all writers really are writing about.
Yes, exactly. Just tell us a little bit about how you uh, instruct your students. Do you use prompts like they do at the community writing project? How is what is your program like, and how does it compare with the community writing project?
So we typically read something together as a class, and in the classroom at Stateville, we read Ta-Nehisi Coates's memoir, and we read a lot of James Baldwin. We read interviews and essays. We read Jessamine Ward's book, Men We Reaped, which is a beautiful memoir. We read Edwidge Danticat's book, Brother, I'm Dying, which is about Haiti. And then we talked about the books, and we talked about poetry as well, some poetry by my own teacher and mentor, Derek Walcott, the late, great Nobel laureate Caribbean poet. And we talked about what the work meant to us and how it sounded and how it was set up on the page and what the essays, why the essays were essays, why the poems were poems, why the short stories were short stories. And then we tried to write our own works that didn't necessarily mimic the works we loved, but that aimed to reach heights like the heights we thought the greatest works reached. In other words, we set the bar high. And in my classrooms, whether they're in university settings or at Stateville, I try to have a really deep conversation about work and about why writing matters so much, why it is that when people are locked away from the ones they love, they have a tendency to scratch poems in the walls, and why when we read something that seems true or beautiful to us, it's the opposite of loneliness. We feel a connection to other human beings. And so we have that conversation, and we try to make work that's moving and that matters.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you and your students study how the words are said on the page, how they look on the page, because I know that eventually a lot of your students became artists as well. But that the studying how the words look on pages lead to some of that art.
I think that's really true. That's an apt observation. And sometimes poetry is visual, and it matters where there's blank space. It guides you in terms of reading out loud. When do you take a breath? When are you looking at a big chunk of prose, and what does that make you feel like? What does that make you experience? How does that make you say the words? My other poetry teacher, Robert Pinsky, talks about the tongue and the voice being the instrument of poetry, the body being the place which poetry originates in, and the voice being the way in which we share poetry. And I think there's a visual component to that as well, how you look at something and how you read it. And it's true that a lot of our students at Stateville are also visual artists, and that there's an interesting kind of overlap between how you place words on the page if you're making a poem, and where you put images or objects or shadowing or light if you're making a painting or a drawing.
Mm, that's interesting. Did you say that another of your mentors is Robert Pinsky? Didn't he write a lot for the Paris Review?
Yes, and he actually led a very democratic and beautiful civic minded project when he was poet laureate. a project he called the Favorite Poem Project. I admired and loved this project. He asked Americans to send their favorite poems or videos of themselves reading their favorite poems. And, you know, people often say, like, I hate poetry or I don't like poetry. And I think some people have had poetry ruined for them in a number of ways. But actually, if you dig deep and if you ask people, but haven't you ever liked a poem? Do you have any poems memorized? Do you have a song memorized that might also be a poem in some sense? Most people will have one. And one of the things that Robert's My Favorite Poem Project did was honor that, honor that truth, which is that most people have at least one or two poems they love and have always loved. And so he had this very democratic project where anybody could send in his or her their favorite poem. And there's this giant archive of just regular people reciting and reading poems that have mattered to them. It's quite a beautiful project.
Mm. So is that project still in place now?
It's online, yes.
It
You can
is.
find the My Favorite Poem Project, and there's an anthology of poetry that came out from it as well.
Did any of your students at Stateville submit poetry to the favorite poem project?
That's such a good question. Not that I know of. I actually wasn't teaching poetry this term. I was teaching memoir. And
Mm-hmm.
my students published their memoirs in an anthology called Real Conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And we called the issue Humans of Life Row. Oh, yes, you have a copy there. I'm so happy to see it. And I think some of those pieces in that anthology are poems. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't know whether my students sent poems to the My Favorite Poem Project. And I'm not 100% sure that you can still send poems in. I don't know whether it's still up and running in that way. It was quite a few years ago.
Yes, this is such a great work. There all of the selections are so interesting and sad, of course, and then they're very reflective. We've been reading a couple of selections over the weeks here at WZRD.
Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Uh, okay. So when this year you've been studying. Your students have been studying writing memoirs with you. What are the other last year and the previous years? What subjects do you select to study? What uh, categories or genres?
Well, at University of Chicago and NYU and BU, I taught all sorts of things. I taught a class on truth and beauty for a long time.
Mhm.
I've taught classes on literary empathy, which is really a way of thinking about how writing gives us access to human beings who are not us. And that's both reading and writing. I've taught classes on how to make a character in fiction. You know, most of my books are novels. I've actually published 5 novels and 2 collections of poetry and 1 memoir. So the bulk of my own work is fiction. And I like fiction because it allows you to make things up and you can ask what you want asked in the world by way of characters you create who say and do things that help you make the meaning that you're trying to make. I find nonfiction a little bit trickier that way. So I teach classes on plot, how to build the infrastructure underneath a novel, and just how to make a novel in general, because novels are, of course, incredibly long, and it's very daunting to try to sit down and make a novel. So I teach students what the building blocks are for a good novel and how to work on a project that you can sustain or that can sustain itself over 300 pages and over years of your life. And then I teach classes on research and imagination, what parts of our work come from the world and from reading and from archives and from objects and photographs and documents and deep research, and how we wed that research to imagining and creating in order to make literature.
Do you and maybe your students too, do you find that it's easier to write when you don't actually sit down to write a novel? It's easier to write when you already have that novel within you that is waiting to come out. There's something that you really need to share with the world, and does that create an easier flow for a novel?
That would be great. I would love to have a whole novel within me and just be the conduit for liberating it. I think when I sit down to write, I try to write a question. I try to write one idea, or I have a sense of a character and I want to see what that character does in a context which is difficult. James
Mm.
Baldwin talks about how wonder is really the central engine for writing, and how often when you're writing, you are curious about something that you maybe don't even fully want to know, something that compels you, in other words. So there's a force inside you that compels you to investigate something. For me, that's usually a question. And that question is often an emotional question or an intellectual question about what would it feel like if I had this experience? I'll hear about an experience someone else has, or I'll have part of an experience and I'll wonder, what if this had gone the other way? Or what if I were this other kind of person in this context? How would that feel? What would that look like for me? And how might I respond? Or I'll hear about something someone does, which I find surprising. And I'll wonder, in what context would I make that same choice? And then I try to work around those questions. And I do think if you sit down and try to write a novel, you'll be very daunted. So it's better to sit down and try to write a chapter or try to write a page of something. And then you can build that into a longer project over the course of time.
Mhm. Um, so are your students, they're writing their memoirs now, so they're probably writing in little sections, right? Have you ever had a student at Stateville that wants to write a novel or perhaps is in the process of writing a novel?
Of course, many of my students there are writing novels, and some are making short stories, which they're trying to build into novels. One of my students just completed a memoir. It's 200
Mm,
pages. Actually, I think it's almost done, maybe three-quarters of the way done. I think he needs a few more chapters at the very end, but he has the bulk of a full book about his childhood, about his coming of age, and it's very carefully rendered and beautiful, and the chapters work, and it moves in a very moving way. So yeah, a lot of them are working on full length manuscripts. Some fiction, some nonfiction, some poetry, and a couple of my students there have completed poetry collections.
mm, that's great. How do your students write? Are they able to access a computer and type, or do they have to write longhand since they are uh, incarcerated?
They have to write longhand, and
Mm,
it's it they should have access to computers or word processors. There are word processors at Stateville. I don't understand the bureaucracy that prevents them from typing. We have a lot of research assistants who help us type documents for them. So we do a lot of transcribing through the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project. And I sometimes transcribe my students' works when I want to be able to see them printed or see how long they are, or just help my students have a clear version. It's obviously much easier to revise if you have a typed version of your own pages. I mean,
different. Mhm.
actually, the memoir I mentioned a minute ago, written by one of my really, really brilliant and thoughtful students, is handwritten. And I read it on lined paper, handwritten in pen, in tiny, beautiful penmanship. And have sent it to our research assistants to transcribe over the summer so that my student will have a full typed manuscript and can then tell, how many pages is it actually, how big should the font be, what does it look like when it's typed up, and then he can go in and revise it more easily without having to rewrite it by hand each time he revises, which is what he's been doing.
Mhm. Wow. Um, so how have your students changed since they like how long have your students been with you and for how many years and how have they changed from the beginning to what they are now?
Well, I've only known my students at Stateville for a year and a half or 2 years, actually.
Mhm.
And they've changed in the ways that students often change, which is to say they know each other better. I mean, the other thing I would say about my classrooms, wherever they are, the students are the community. It's a community of human beings who are navigating, emotional chaos and intellectual wonder and all the things human beings everywhere are navigating. And so I think once you're in a collaboration with other writers and readers, you start to navigate that together. And so people change based on the people around them and the conversation. And one of the things I love about teaching undergraduates, for example, is that they're not dogmatic. They have opinions. They're very politically conscientious and aware of the world, but they're also able to hear each other. They really listen. And that's been true of my students at Stateville as well. They listen to one another and they change their minds about work and about reading and about writing. And they change my mind. We had a very interesting conversation about James Baldwin. I've been teaching this James Baldwin interview and essay for years and years and years. The essay is called The Creative Process. And the interview is an interview in the Paris Review, which you mentioned earlier in the context of Robert's work. And in the interview, he talks about the difference between preaching and writing. And he says something like what I was saying earlier about how writing is really about not knowing and working to figure out something you don't know, and in some cases don't want to know. Whereas preaching is about already knowing. You know the thing, or you know the conclusion, and you want to get up in front of the congregation and convey that conclusion or that meaning to your congregants. And when we read that essay, I've read it for years and years at University of Chicago. My students really like it. And I think one of the reasons it speaks to them is because it gives them permission to write about things they don't know. And we all need that permission. We've been told our whole lives, oh, write what you know, but there's so much we don't know. Does that mean we're not allowed to write that? And if we write what we know, are we being self-righteous? Are we being pedantic? Are we dogmatic? And so my students at U Chicago have loved that essay. And when I taught it at Stateville, my students really objected to it. And they said, some of them said, Baldwin was a deeply religious man. Baldwin was, of course, himself a minister before he was a writer. And they said that the words on the page which he's making are evidence of God speaking through him. And so to them, preaching and writing were the same. Not to all of them, of course, but to 3 or 4 students who were leaders in our class discussion. And that was very interesting for me. That was not an idea I had ever had. I had never heard that idea articulated in my classroom before. And so I just use it as an example of saying we all change our minds all the time in an oxygenated classroom, in a good classroom. And so I think one of the ways I've watched my students change is by way of watching them talk to each other about the readings. And then the other way I've watched them change is just to build confidence. And of course, that's delightful as a teacher. When you have a student who comes in feeling like, oh, I'm not a real writer, or I don't have all the tools to write, and then works and works and works and realizes it's just a question of tenacity and diligence and channeling the talents and the tools I do have. And I can make work that moves my classmates, that people care about, that people respond to. And I love watching that happen. It's one of the great joys of teaching.
Mm-hmm. I guess your students develop friendships now because of the class, right? A lot of them did not know each other before the class.
That's true. And in fact, in some cases, they write about those friendships. One of my favorite essays from the semester last year was it's about one of my students trying to make a series of difficult choices, and they're subtle choices in terms of interacting with other human beings. And at the very end of the essay, he names another one of my students and says, I just thought, what would this person do? And then I went and I talked to him, and there's a section of dialogue between the two of them in which my student, the writer, gets advice from my other student and takes the advice and bases the choice he makes on the advice from this other student. And I know that they met in the classroom.
Oh, that's beautiful. How many students are in your class?
At Stateville, 15.
Mm. So that's very a good number for a deep interaction and thoughtful interaction and also how a good way to spend the time. How long do you have for the class?
3 hours. And I agree. I think 15 is about the maximum that you can have for a workshop where you're working on student work.
Mm-hmm. And how often are you able to meet?
That class was once a week. The class is actually done now, but we met once a week for 14 weeks for a semester.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so the works in Humans of Life Role are from that class, or is it from?
Exactly. They're from that class. It was called Writing Our Lives. And I co-taught it. I actually co-taught the class with my father-in-law, who's a longtime activist and professor.
Are you talking about Bill Ayers?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, Bill Ayers is my dad-in-law, and he's a lifelong educator and activist and a marvelous teacher. And one of the great joys of teaching the class and of publishing our students' work in Real Conditions was apprenticing myself to Bill. Getting to teach with him was a great joy for me.
Okay. So I guess, so did Bill start this project?
No, I mean, the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project has been around for a while, and they hire teachers from around the city. and from the universities. And I think Bill has taught for them before.
Mhm.
And Bill definitely was the engine behind setting up the Real Conditions publication.
Mhm. Well, we heard about the issues with lack of clean water at Stateville. Do your students ever mention these and other problems that they encounter in Stateville?
Of course, a lot of their writing is about their daily lives and the texture of what it feels like to live at Stateville. And they write about it beautifully, and they write about their hope for better futures, which I think we all hope for, and they write about wishing for dignity, which of course all human beings wish for and want, and they also write about the very difficult conditions under which they live. I don't know if you saw that Pritzker just announced that they're going to tear down Stateville and Logan,
Mhm.
which seems on the surface to be good news, but then it turns out they're dedicating $900 million to rebuilding. And it's a complicated issue because on the one hand, you want clean water and you want humane facilities for people. But on the other hand, the system of incarceration doesn't work. And so it's disturbing to imagine dedicating $900 million, almost $1 billion, to doubling down on that system, to rebuilding these places, which we know are deeply unjust. And so I feel very concerned about it. And, my students talk and write and think with tremendous sophistication and elegance and complexity about this news, about the question of tearing down and rebuilding the prisons in Illinois.
Mhm.
I've actually been teaching students across the state in various ways, and asking them to write haiku about $900 million. I haven't really mentioned to young students that this is a question about rebuilding prisons or not, because I think it doesn't have to be. But I've been teaching haiku, which it's just 5 7 5, right? 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. So it's a very elegant and easy formal structure to grasp. And I've been asking kids, for example, to write poems about what they would do if they had $900 million. I'm calling it the 900 Million Poetry Project. And I'm just thinking about ways to beautify Illinois, ways to protect our community, ways to protect our environments, ways to protect ourselves and the people we love. And needless to say, I've asked dozens and dozens of people to write haikus, and nobody has written a haiku saying I would spend the $900 million on prisons or prison renovations. So I think sometimes art is a good way to respond to or to ask questions about our established routines and ways of treating human beings. So maybe your listeners can send me 900 million poems, some haiku about what would you do if you had $900 million. That's so much money.
Mhm.
Imagine the healthcare we could have. Imagine the public schools we could build, the basketball courts, Olympic-sized swimming pools in every school, huge libraries, community centers. Imagine the beauty we could create with that money, and use haiku to express it in an efficient and poetic way.
Mm, that sounds great. Yeah, send them in to Rachel. You could later tell us where our listeners could send the haiku to, and then I hope that you'll be receiving that. This is like a poll about how to spend the public money.
Exactly. Almost $1 billion. What would you
Mhm.
do with $1 billion to beautify Illinois or to make Illinois protected?
Mhm.
You can send it to my email. It's just my name, Rachel DeWoskin at Gmail.
Okay. Yeah, we'll include that in the description for this interview. When your students meet, is that do you go to Stateville or is it by Zoom?
I go to Stateville.
Mhm. And what is the classroom like? Is it in a library? If you're allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, there's a schoolhouse. There's a set of classrooms, and we have, desks and chairs, and we sit in a circle and we talk to one another. And it's an elaborate process. Anyone who's ever visited a prison, which I think most people have, knows that it's difficult to get in. There's a lot of security, there's a lot of searches. a lot of guards leading you, corrections officers leading you through the facility. But Stateville has let a lot of faculty in, let a lot of professors in, and the students have really benefited from it. And you know, the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project has a beautiful central tenet, which is education for everyone, everywhere. People deserve to read books. People deserve to have a conversation about the world and how to make it better and how to make their own and all of our lives better. And people should be educated no matter what. I wish there were way more curriculum. I wish there were classes all day happening there. And if the infrastructure could allow for teachers in every prison and volunteers to come in and read poetry with students, I think that would be humane and good.
What kind of books do the students over there do the people at Stateville have access to? Do they have a library? How extensive is that library?
They do have a library. I would say it's medium, but it's not bad. But overall, and Stateville, they're fortunate at Stateville to have a library, and there are good organizations moving books into prisons. But Tracy D. Hall, who was the executive director of the American Library Association last year, told me that the worst censorship and the worst kind of restrictions to what people can read is actually happening in prisons, which I found really interesting. I think most people are aware that free reading is under attack in America and that books are being banned and burned left and right. And books are being taken off library shelves in many, many communities. And apparently it's especially acute in places where people are incarcerated. And that needs to change. People need to have access to books. It's very difficult, I think, to imagine a better life or to imagine transformation without reading. And so there's no reason to restrict what people read. And in fact, we have every reason to allow as much access to literature and art as we possibly can for every human being. It's a human right.
Mhm. If you hadn't brought in the creative process for your students to read, they would not have been able to access it at the library, right? It wasn't forbidden, but it
That's
wasn't
true.
included.
That's true. And I think that's why education too. I think one thing that professors can do and educators can do is point people toward works that will matter. And this is of course something librarians also do and do in such a beautiful and sometimes under celebrated way. I think of all the librarians who have connected kids to the books that saved those kids' lives in many cases. And they're often unsung heroes. And I think, as teachers, we try to find the pieces of work in the world that will matter most to our students and that will allow our students to make the work that is going to be their best work. And for me, James Baldwin is actually often that person. My favorite novel is his novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. And so I try to teach that no matter where I'm teaching. And I love this Canadian poet, Anne Carson. And I try to teach her books no matter where I'm teaching. And I love the book Citizen by Claudia Rankine. And I teach that no matter where I go. So I think of myself sometimes as a little like mobile library. Like everywhere I go, I give people homework, even if they're not my students. And that homework often includes a series of books which have mattered so much to me that I feel like the greatest thing I can possibly do in my own life is to make sure as many people as possible have read Go Tell It on the Mountain and Autobiography of Red, which is my favorite Anne Carson book, and Citizen by Claudia Rankine.
Well, these several books that you mentioned, have people read them because you recommended the books to them, and have they gotten back to you with their reaction?
Of course. I mean, my students have been required to get back to me with their reaction, right? I have my students have to write critical responses and papers and their own work based on the works that we read. And so, yeah, I have decades worth of student papers on the books I love most. And that's also something very satisfying as a teacher to read the critical responses by your students to works that you yourself love, because those critical responses often open up new ideas for you or change your mind. I mean, we were talking about that earlier, ways people change in the classroom. And each time I read a batch of student papers on Autobiography of Red or on Go Tell It on the Mountain, I learn something new about the book, and it makes me want to read it again, which is good because I read it constantly.
Mhm. What about the Native Son? Is that work allowed? Is that the book in the Stateville Library? Do they allow it?
I think they allow it. I don't think that they're terribly restrictive
Mm-hmm.
in the library there, but I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't know what's in the collection there. I haven't actually been through the library there. I know that we were allowed to bring in the books on our syllabi. And
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm sure somebody reviews the syllabi, but they were good to us about what we wanted to teach. We
Mm-hmm.
made a list of books and we were able to get those books and we were able to bring the books in for our students. And our students really cherish books there. And they
Mm-hmm.
share books in a way that I think is very democratic and good. People pass books around to one another in a generous and thoughtful way.
Do you find that your students who they have access to so little at Stateville, do they treasure the classwork and homework more than some of your students at maybe other institutions?
I think most of my students treasure education, but I will say that my students who are incarcerated have an enormous capacity for gratitude about getting to read and getting to write, and that they care profoundly about the work that they're doing, and they care a lot about one another's work, which makes for a very good classroom. It makes for a very engaged set of humans and a very deep conversation. And I think they really, really want to write and they really want to publish. They really want to be in a conversation that transcends the confined situation in which they live their lives. So writing is also a way to reach out beyond yourself and beyond whatever are the walls that surround you. And so for people who are incarcerated, I think that's a special opportunity and kind of a responsibility too. And so they care a lot about what they say and how they represent themselves. And one of the things that their work really does is it reminds readers that we're all human beings. It humanizes people who are incarcerated, and it allows us to see one another across a distance and across a confining wall or a barricade, which could prevent us from having any communication and shouldn't.
Mhm. Oftentimes, students are not meeting their grade level in reading, and that prevents them from accessing better education, and that often leads them to a limited choice, and sometimes that might lead to them be to people becoming incarcerated. How do your how are the reading levels of your students? Are they very literate? Are they able to read right away, like these books that you're bringing to them?
My students are very literate, and I think in many cases by force of just unbelievable will and tenacity, because
Mhm.
I do think a lot of them had very few opportunities growing up.
That's what I
I
thought.
don't think, yeah, I think it's very unfair. And one of our former students, who was incarcerated and is now has been released, often talks about second chances and how it isn't really a second chance once you get out. It's a first chance, because a lot of the people who are incarcerated never had a first chance. They really didn't stand a chance. And if kids don't have resources and if they don't have a education, they're in trouble, and I think it would benefit our society. Here's an example: we could spend $900 million supporting young people and giving them hope, giving them ways to read, giving them projects to do when they're young, so that they don't find trouble and trouble doesn't find them. I think you're exactly right that the literacy question is tied to a larger question of socioeconomic and racial injustice, which leads in many cases to incarceration of brown and black boys.
Mhm. Do you know if in Stateville those that are they don't have the literacy skills, do they have any resources to improve those skills so that they still might at least read more books and then maybe find learn more about the legal system and then also get involved in classes such as yours?
I think there's a writing center there, and I have watched many of my students tutor my other students.
Mm.
So I had one student who came to me early in the semester and said, I have trouble reading he was not a visual learner, so had trouble reading on the page and did much better with audio
Ah,
texts.
mhm,
And where we couldn't get him audiobooks, one of my other students just read the books out loud with him. And
mhm,
they read them together. And I found that really moving. And I
mhm,
think, in a way, those kinds of systems of community support are really huge. And allowing those to flourish is something Stateville does do. Like, my students are allowed to read with each other, and they are allowed to tutor each other, and they do have a writing center, and they do have a lot of faculty coming in. And I don't think that everybody gets to take the classes, and I wish everybody did, but I think that's also a supply and demand issue. There aren't quite enough classes. There's not enough curriculum, and I'm sure that that's true across other facilities. And it would be good, anybody who's a teacher out there, it would be so nice to find your local correctional facility, as they're called, and see if you can't volunteer, come in and read with people, or bring books, or have a conversation. See if there's not some project in your community that allows for that. I mean, the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project does an absolutely stunningly good job of giving people access to education, and I think there are projects like that in many communities. And if there isn't one in your community, maybe try to start one.
mhm. When those students read together, like your student is reading for his classmate because so they're reading the book together, and I guess they learn differently from reading it together than from reading it on their own, right?
I think that's probably right. Yeah. I think it might feel more communal or even
Mhm.
more theatrical. I think anytime you read something out loud, it's a different experience, right? Than if you just read it in the quiet of your own brain with your eyes. Years ago, one of my novels is about a woman who loses her eyesight in an accident, a young woman, and she has to learn how to calibrate meaning, how to see basically without her vision, without her eyes.
Mhm.
I've always been very interested in sight and insight and blindness. And I learned Braille when I was working on the book. I went to the Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind, which is a gorgeous organization. And I was fascinated by yet another way to read, another new experience of reading. That is to say, when you read Braille, you can read in total darkness, and you're using your hands, to form the words or to recognize the words. And I think a lot about the different ways in which we take in work, if we're reading it, or if somebody's reading it to us, or if, as you mentioned, we're reading it to each other or with each other. Or I think a lot of people now listen to audiobooks, right? And so there's a third person in that exchange as well. There's the author, there's the
Mhm.
person listening to the book or reading the book, and then there's the actor or the voiceover person who's actually narrating the book. And it becomes a sort of more communal engagement. So I guess in some way, I often think of it, and maybe this is because of my work on the book Blind and learning Braille, but I think of it as almost a spectrum from total solitude, the way in which you can inhabit a novel in the dark in Braille, to kind of communal readings, where you read something together, or you read with another person, or you involve an audiobook.
Are you able to read as fast as are you able to read in Braille as fast as you could with sight?
No, no, I never got that good at Braille. I was pretty proficient. I mean, that book came out maybe 10 years ago now. Well, no, maybe, yeah. Oh my God, 2015, I think. I think it's almost 10 years ago. And I worked very diligently at Braille, but it was quite difficult, actually. I found Braille difficult to learn. I was already in my 30s, late 30s, early 40s, when I was working on it. Um, I got okay at it, but I was never as quick as I am at just reading with and I cheated all the time. I was constantly looking and peeking, and my Braille, I was apologizing all the time to my Braille tutor. I kept saying, "Oh my God, Katie, I'm cheating. I'm sorry. I just looked at it." And she said, "You should use all of your resources," which I thought was such a nice idea. She was not a
Mhm.
stickler about the rules.
Mhm.
Um, but I was able to read stories and articles and essays in the evenings. I would read them in the dark. And when I was a little kid, it was my fondest wish to be able to read past lights out. My parents had some, bedtime for me or whatever. I had to turn the lights off at
Mhm.
10:30 or something. And I
Yeah.
used to have a flashlight, which of course I would get caught because my parents could see that I had a flashlight. And I remember once I filled a jar with fireflies. I was quite little, and I thought, oh, I'll
Oh.
just build this firefly jar and I'll light my reading, my late night, criminal reading. My parents will not be able to find me. And the fireflies died. And I was so devastated as a little kid. And it wasn't until I was 40 and learned Braille that I realized if I had just learned Braille as a kid, I could have just had the book in my bed and my parents wouldn't have. And it was too late by then.
Mhm. Do you know if there are a lot of prisons that are like Stateville that have these like PNAP programs and writing courses, university courses in their facilities, in their institutions?
I wish that there were more.
Hmm.
I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, and the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project would know those. Probably you can look them up,
Hmm.
but it's not, certainly it's not ubiquitous, and it should be. I mean, I deeply believe in PNAP's mission, which is education for everyone, everywhere. I think everyone should have access, and so wherever there are these programs, let's build them, and wherever there are not, let's start them.
Hmm. What is the waiting list like? You said that it's very hard to get into PNAP and these courses. Do you know how hard it is?
I don't know that, but I do know that most of our students have already been through several other courses, and that it takes, you have to have some basic courses under your belt before you can move on to more courses.
Hmm.
Again, you could ask the folks who run PNAP for the very specific details of that. I don't know what the details are, but I know that the courses are competitive.
Hmm.
People want to get in, and I don't know how many people are on the wait lists.
And do you know if they have to pay for them? They don't have any money, but I don't know if they're like being
No, no, no. The classes are not. They don't. They're free.
okay. Yeah, I was just I wouldn't think that the PNAP would want to charge them, but who knows about the prison and all that, state.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. Okay. And then what is the status of the art project? Because I saw that some of your students are doing art. What are some of those pieces? I think I've even seen some of the pieces displayed somewhere. What is the progress of that?
There was a beautiful exhibit up for the last couple months at CoPro Space called "More Beautiful, More Terrible: Humans of Life Row," and it
Mhm.
actually just closed last week. But you can find photographs from it online, and it was extremely moving. A lot of my students had work in it, including one of my students had these two charcoal drawings, one of himself with his hands against the wall, and another, a kind of smaller one next to him of his nephew, who was only 2.5 at the time, also with his hands against the wall, practicing something so sad and moving about watching this little baby get ready to be frisked or imitate kind of what he's seeing in the American system. And there was a timeline of mass incarceration, also very moving, a big research project that the guys did collaboratively. And they had this timeline which wrapped all the way around a corner of the exhibit space, and then interwoven into the timeline of mass incarceration were their own stories. Um, and so I think you can probably find photographs of that project online. And then in the center of the exhibit, they had many daily objects, per your earlier question about how our students talk about their lives and the places they inhabit and the water at Stateville, for example. They had like ingenious objects that are just part of daily life. They're like this little makeshift shower tube that people have invented so that they can take showers in the cells. It's like a little tube that attaches to the faucet in the cell so that you can have a shower even if you're just in your cell and don't have access to the actual showers. And sneakers, which are meaningful, and objects from their parents' houses, their families' houses, objects that have mattered to them enormously. And it just gave this very kaleidoscopic sense of what life is like for so many people in America, so many incarcerated people.
Is that the exhibit that was at the Harold Washington Library? I,
Um, I don't know. This was at a space called CoPro
oh,
on the south side. I don't know. What was it, Harold Washington Library? Was that also a PNAP
it,
project?
it seemed as if it was the artists were incarcerated people. And
Uh-huh.
it was, I think we saw it about a year or so ago. So I'll look into that, but I thought that it was connected. It was very moving, and it occupied like at least one or two rooms. It was really nice. And it did kind of like go around along the walls. Of course, it was an exhibit, but it did like it was similar to what you were describing. So,
Hmm.
okay. Uh, and so when is the next session? When is your next class for PNAP then?
I don't know yet. I don't have my schedule, but PNAP is running classes in the fall.
Mhm.
Because I don't know exactly what the schedule is going to be next year because of the renovations at Stateville.
Mm.
I don't have the schedule yet, but hopefully I'll be teaching in the fall or the winter or the spring.
Yes, I hope so too. And how were you able to get this book published of your students' work?
Well, I mean, we owe that largely to Janice Hertig, who's such
Mhm.
a force of power and good in the world. And, she's an editor, and Real Conditions is such a civic minded and generous paper. And she gave us a guest issue. And we worked really hard to get work from our students that they were proud of and excited about. And then Bill and I co-wrote an introduction trying to describe the experience of being in that classroom week after week and how much we wanted to introduce our students to everyone else. We want people to know each other, and we want the conversation to be wider, also to be outside the walls. Um, and so publishing our students in an anthology was one way to do that.
Mm.
And we are so grateful to Janice for giving us that space and giving us the platform and the amplification. And our students have been so happy. I'll tell you one story. We gave a reading at Pilsen Community Books a couple of weeks ago. And it was Bill, my dad in law, and co professor and co editor, and Ronaldo Hudson, who's formerly incarcerated writer and artist and intellectual, and I. And Bill and Ronaldo read and talked, and I read a piece of one of our students' work from the anthology. And there was great enthusiasm in the audience for this piece. And then I realized that two of the people in the audience were, in fact, his parents.
Mm.
And they were there listening. And it was so nice to meet his parents. I've known him now for, many, many months. And I know his work extremely well. And meeting his family just gave me a sense of the width of his own life and his world outside the walls.
Mm.
And it filled me with hope. And they were so proud. I mean, his writing is really beautiful, and they were so proud of him and his story. And it was just really nice to get to see that.
How did you connect with Janice? Because she's with the community writing project. Were you just connected with her, or is your work connected with the project as well?
No, we knew about Real Conditions. We knew about her magazine, which we really admire. And I
Mhm.
think that she and Bill know each other maybe from way back,
Uh,
both being community organizers and activists and educators and writers themselves.
mhm. Okay, Rachel DeWoskin, author and also teacher at the PNAP Prisons Neighborhood Arts Project, right? And
Arts and education, yes.
yes, well, thank you so much for all the work that you do, and much luck to you and your students in the future.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your interest in our project and work.
Thank you.